All right, greetings, people. Welcome to another video. This is going to be the first of many videos dedicated to understanding rationality. This is a book, it's an online book called Rationality from AI to Zombies, written by, um, I really want to make sure I get his name right, Rob Bensinger, who I believe is a computer scientist and someone who has insights in computer science. And so I figured it would be an interesting exercise to share this experience as I'm trying to learn rationality. And I think that one of the best things I can do to learn is to share and explain and share my ideas. I'm someone who has a lot of questions when I learn complex concepts, and I find it's useful to work through the problems, work through the concepts one at a time so that we can be as thorough as we can in our learning experience. And so with that, let's jump in. I think the last video is kind of finding the relationship between rationality and philosophy. And in it, we found a very interesting map, which I could pull up, but I will save that for another time. I think for the sake of speed, actually, I think I am going to pull it up. Um, let's see here. There it is. Interesting map of philosophy. I'm going to make sure I have a stopwatch here because I'm trying to go for about 30 minutes right now, not make a video too long or too complex because, the information from my perspective seems almost infinite. But here's the map. And so I think the area that we're going to be focusing on is probably going to be an area of philosophy of science, logic of just and discovery, perhaps I think that's the main area. Maybe perhaps a bit of rational behavior, epistemic logic is another possibility. But somewhere on this map, we're going to be exploring the power of rationality. Now, the way he starts his book is with an introduction, and I've already read the introduction. I won't go too much into too much detail about the introduction because I've already read through it twice. But in it, he basically talks about cognitive bias and that we are born with all kinds of biases. And so the power of rationality, the purpose behind rationality, is to basically learn how to create some sort of methodology so that we can avoid those biases as much as possible. He also kind of describes the books. So these are like books and books. He calls them books, but I think he references them to chapters, these books. But maybe each so-called book or chapter is as long as a book itself. And so this is a multi-book series in a sense. And it goes to show how much information he has to cover. And I think there's like 7 or 8 books and together, 6 books altogether, it seems. And so, he talks about, in the introduction, he also mentions the nature of the 6 books that make up this larger book from AI, Rationality from AI to Zombies. Now, what we're going to focus on for now, we're going to jump into book 1, Map and Territory, and we're going to basically explore what he talks about. And, these videos are not going to be monetizable for copyright reasons. He does use it using Creative Commons. So that's really great, really incredible, but I want to make sure that I cite his work. And so, I'll put a link below directing you to his website and to the book itself. And these videos are going to be non-monetizable work, but I think the value in this session is not simply monetizing the videos, which is not even a guarantee, but actually focusing on the concepts that we're learning. And so let's jump in. Without further ado, let's get into it. Book 1, Map and Territory. What is a belief, and what makes some beliefs work better than others? These 4 sequences explain the Bayesian notion of rationality, belief, and evidence. A running theme: the things we call explanations or theories may not always function like maps for navigating the world. As a result, we risk mixing our mental maps with other objects in our toolbox. And so we can quickly look up what does he mean by Bayesian? And I think it's named after someone, but I think it's like a statistical tool. According to Google, Bayesian refers to a statistical framework based on updating beliefs, probabilities, as new evidence emerges. Using Bayes' theorem, we where probability quantifies the degree of beliefs rather than just frequency, incorporating prior knowledge to form a posterior probability. It's used in the field from science to AI, allowing for dynamic belief revision in the face of data, contrasting with frequentist views by treating parameters as random variables. So a lot of information there. I probably understood maybe about 30-40% of that. But what did stand out to me is to treat each belief as a probability. Um, and now there's a video that we could watch to better understand the Bayesians. It might be worth exploring. Um, but core concepts include subject probability, prior distribution, likelihood, posterior distribution. How it works: start with a prior. You have a belief. Probability of rain is 30%. Observe data. You see weather forecast predicting rain. Update belief. Using Bayes' theorem, you combine your prior belief with the forecasting accuracy to get a new updated probability. And so yeah, now it'd be kind of good to look at Bayes' theorem, right? Which I believe is a mathematical equation for basic probability. And I have seen it before. Here it is. Yeah, the probability of A given B equals the probability of B given A times probability of A divided by the probability of B. Now, one thing that you know, my intuition really tells me, is how on earth did they come up with this equation? Why is this equation so specific in its nature? And that's something that I really hope Rob Bensinger is able to explain, is why are certain equations created in such a specific way? Now, in physics, I understand these a bit more intuitively because a lot of the equations are based on empirical evidence. So, for example, like the equation for gravity, and we're talking about Newton's equation for gravity, not Einstein's equation for gravity. And it does a relatively simple job at describing, of predicting, how much force is going to be acting on a particular object based off of its initial height. How much is it going to be accelerated? Basic kinematic equations. So that's an example to me of where the equations, I'm not exactly sure how the equations were derived, but I do know that they they can be supported by empirical evidence, observable evidence. But when I look at something like Bayes' theorem, when we're dealing with probability, I'm wondering what's the nature of the evidence for that? And these are questions that we could ask ChatGPT, but I'm going to save that because I know it's a deep rabbit hole to kind of dive into, and it'll probably take up the rest of the video and the rest of the session. So I kind of want to save that for later, but I just want to make it clear that my initial reaction to an equation like this is to kind of doubt it and to question it and wonder how valid it really is. I'm sure it's very valid, but to truly understand it, I'm just curious to know of its inherent structure. Why is it structured the way it is? It just seems to be so specific, for something that seems to be very abstract or a loose concept when it comes to understanding probability and understanding the statistical the statistical noise or the statistical likelihood of an event. And so there's that. I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way. So what we're going to do is jump into section A, predictability wrong, and see what he has to say. This is the first section of book 1. This book begins with a sequence on cognitive bias, predictability wrong. The rest of the book won't stick to just this topic. Bad habits and bad ideas matter, even when they arise from our mind's content as opposed to our mind's structure. So already there's a very interesting implication there, which is that our mind's content is different than our mind's structure. Maybe he's getting at the idea that our minds, the memory that we have stored in our minds, is different than the way in which the memory is actually stored, which would make a lot of sense given in the nature. My experience with memory is that it's all over the place. It's like very, very intricate kind of interpersonal, sensory-based experience when it comes to memory. But then the actual nature as to the way it's structured, I would think that would fall under more like neuroscience. or at least that's what neuroscience attempts to do, and realize that our brains are like these biological computers. And I don't think anyone to this day really understands how is memory stored in the brain. Maybe a little bit, but I know that in machine learning, you have something like neural networks, which are a way of uh, basically processing data. And so, it ultimately, even if we can't understand the structure of our minds, we can understand the structure of artificial intelligence. And I think that's something to definitely work towards in this kind of journey that we're on of exploring rationality. Because I don't know if AI is necessarily rational, if it's even thinking cognitively, but it is illogical. It's a logical machine built on logic. But even the nature of machine learning, it seems like you have a lot of loose, kind of strange aspects of data and so on and so forth. So here we go. What do I mean by rationality? What a great question. I mean epistemic rationality, which I think that was actually termed in our philosophical map here. Yep, epistemic logic. And just to be clear, I'm going to look up what is epistemic. I know we've looked it up before, but I'm going to look it up again because I still don't know what it means. Relating to knowledge or to the degree of its validation. So basically, he defines it as systematically improving the accuracy of your beliefs. And then there's instrumental rationality, systematically achieving your values. Okay. So I would say instrumental rationality seems to be more of like a kind of like an interpersonal experience of experiencing life. Maybe I'm someone who's very instrumentally rational, systematically achieving my values, and the way you treat people, the way you care about other people, community, so on and so forth, having a relationship with God. These are ideas that I think are probably fall under instrumental rationality. But then epistemic rationality is improving the accuracy of your beliefs. I would almost say that they sound the same thing, because I would say that beliefs are related to values. What do you believe in? I believe in my values, right? So I'm not exactly sure what the two differences are. This is a question that we could ask ChatGPT. It's tempting, but I think we're going to keep, just for the sake of flow state, we're going to keep reading and not get too bogged down in the details of what he's getting at. I think it's also important to mention that I do think Rob is going to be an expert in rationality, but my take on rationality so far is that I don't think there's a single person that has a true mastery of it. Maybe Aristotle, maybe Plato did, maybe these philosophers in the past possibly had a mastery of rationality. I mean, maybe certain scientists and mathematicians in the world today are have some form of rationality behind them, and not necessarily them too. But I think it's important to know that we're going to rely on Rob as a teacher, because I definitely presume he knows a heck of a lot more than we do. But I think it's also important to understand that we're studying it from his perspective. And so his perspective on rationality may not be the same perspective of our own when it comes to understanding it. And then, of course, it makes me wonder, well, how good is my rationality then? Whose rationality is better? And I think what we're trying to work towards is to get to a universal place of rationality, understanding the universal building blocks of rationality. And so already, like epistemic rationality, instrumental rationality, I don't think there should be more than one type of rationality. I think rationality should just be rationality. But anyways, let's continue reading and see what he's trying to say. When you open your eyes and look at the room around you, you'll locate your laptop in relation to the table, and you'll locate a bookcase in relation to the wall. If something goes wrong with your eyes, your brain, then your mental model might say there's a bookcase where no bookcase exists, and when you go over to get a book, you'll be disappointed. Yeah, I would agree with that. This is what it's like to have a false belief, a map of the world that doesn't correspond to the territory. Epistemic rationality is about building accurate maps instead. So I would say when he gets at beliefs, I guess beliefs are, we got to be really careful with definitions here. But my understanding or my take on what a belief is an interpretation of reality in a sense. especially based off of like where do you believe the laptop or the bookcase is located. If that's a belief, then I would say it's kind of like interpretation of reality. And so in that sense, epistemic rationality is more about understanding reality, and having a relationship with reality, in a sense, having, how accurate is your understanding of reality. I wouldn't call it a belief, because, believing, you can believe in God, for example, right? And I don't necessarily think God is, like, God is beyond reality, in a sense. Reality is encompassed in God, but, God is much more mysterious in that sense. While instrumental rationality, this is where I feel like, in a kind of more spiritual domain, if you want to call it that, or just like perhaps a metaphysical domain, or simply a domain where you're trying to work on yourself and you're trying to improve yourself. And he talks about values. So, very valuable, I think, as a human being. But this is something that may be unique to humans, right? Um, I don't know if other animals have this, have that value system. I think some dogs do. It seems like dogs do, and even some birds and cats, and other animals probably, in some way. But I just wonder, like, how many conscious beings are using instrumental rationality, while I think every conscious being, to some degree, whether conscious or not, whether doing it unconsciously or consciously, they are exploring. They're exploring epistemic rationality. That's how you kind of understand your environment. So, instrumental rationality, on the other hand, is about steering reality, sending the future where you want it to go. It's the art of choosing actions that lead to outcomes ranked higher in your preferences. I sometimes call this winning. Interesting. Okay, so there's like a very social component to this, social, spiritual, maybe metaphysical, interpersonal, setting goals, having, being a visionary person, having ambitions, having, well, perhaps even wants and desires to some degree kind of overlap with this, but it all kind of ties together with the idea of values. And I feel like this is something that, like, a person like Jordan Peterson would spend a lot of time explaining, and I'm not exactly sure what it's called. Maybe morals, maybe ethics. This might fall under ethics, perhaps, which is a form of philosophy. So, rationality is about forming true beliefs and making winning decisions. Okay. Pursuing truth here doesn't mean dismissing uncertain or indirect evidence. Looking at the room around you and building a mental map of it isn't different in principle from believing that the earth has a molten core, or that Julius Caesar was bald. Those questions, being distant from you in space and time, might seem more airy and abstract than the questions about your bookcase. Yet these are facts of the matter about the state of the Earth's core in 2015 CE, and about the state of Caesar's head in 50 BCE. These facts may have real effects upon you, even if you never find a way to meet Caesar or the core face to face. So again, I would say that epistemic rationality is kind of like a scientific methodology, seeking evidence and seeking truth via evidence and observation. And winning here does not come at the expense of others. The project of life can be about collaboration or self-sacrifice rather than about competition. I definitely love this idea of collaboration. That's partly why we're making these videos. Your values here mean anything you care about, including other people. It isn't restricted to selfish values or unshared values. Right, absolutely. Why would it be restricted to only selfish or unshared values? Um, there may be universal qualities to these values, perhaps. When people say X is rational, it's usually just a more strident way of saying I think X is true or I think X is good. Interesting. That's certainly one way. That's one take on it. I understand this concept here. I think X is true. That sounds very much like a mathematical statement to me. I think X is good. I don't know if I entirely agree with that. I would say more like I think X is. So why has an additional word for rational as so why have an additional word for rational as well as true and good? That sentence is incomplete. So why have an addition? Oh, so why have? Excuse me. So why have an additional word for rational when we have words like true and good? An analogous argument can be given against using true. There's no need to say it is true that snow is white when you could just say snow is white. And this kind of enters the syntax of the English language, or many other languages for that matter, and realizing that these languages have a fundamentally different logic structure than like the logic structure used in logic, the language of logic, and I think by extension, the language of rationality. What makes the idea of truth useful is that it allows us to talk about general features of map territory correspondence. And to be clear, what is correspondence? Presumably what corresponds to something, a close or similar connection or equivalence. True models usually produce better experimental predictions than false models. Okay, now I would agree with that. Is a useful generalization. This is actually a statement. This could be actually a math statement. It's a useful generalization, and it's not one you can make without using a concept like true or accurate. Okay. Similarly, rational agents make decisions that maximize the probabilistic expectation of a coherent utility function. Similarly, here's another statement. Rational agents make decisions that maximize the probabilistic expectation of a coherent utility function. That's definitely a mouthful. I'm going to read that one more time. What I'm trying to understand what they're trying to say. Rational agents make decisions that maximize the probabilistic expectation of a coherent utility function. I guess I just don't know what a coherent utility function even is, but we can quickly look it up. It refers to a mathematical function used to model decision making that adheres to specific axioms of rationality and consistency, ensuring the agent or system is not exploitable. Okay. Anyways, this statement is the kind of thought that depends on a concept of instrumental rationality, whereas, interesting, he's saying instrumental, I would think it would be epistemic. Whereas it's rational to eat vegetables can probably be replaced with it's useful to eat vegetables, or it's in your interest to eat vegetables. We need a concept like rational in order to know general facts about those ways of thinking that systematically produce truth or value, and the systematic ways in which we fall short of those standards. It's fair to say that Rob is very, very intelligent, and he explains things in a very specific way. And so I think the reason why I want to share this experience with other people is because I'm sure I'm not the only one who has slightly difficulty reading this kind of structure of thought. And I think it's very useful to unpack the process. What he's saying is basically there are more simple statements that can be explained rationally. That can be explained that not explained rationally, but that have an easier rational structure to follow. Whereas this first statement apparently is using instrumental rationality. I'm not exactly sure why, because I don't really see any mentioning of values here. I don't see any like notion of values or ethics taking part in this statement. To me, this is like still something that an AI would be able to think through. And it's funny I say that because a lot of what AI training is about is to make sure that they sound ethical. So that's kind of ironic, actually. But we'll keep going on. I think it's important to understand that we're not going to understand everything 100%, but we're still going to try our very best and make more sense. But like for example, I would say that this has nothing to do with instrumental rationality. This is entirely epistemic rationality, but it's a more complex version of it. Sometimes experimental psychologists uncover human reasoning that seems very strange. For example, someone rates the probability Bill plays jazz as less than the probability that Bill is an accountant who plays jazz. This seems like an odd judgment, since any particular jazz playing accountant is obviously a jazz player. Oh my gosh, what a riddle. Any particular jazz playing accountant is obviously a jazz player. So the probability of Bill playing jazz is less than the probability that Bill is an accountant who plays jazz. I have no idea. I feel like I just don't have enough data, frankly. I mean, Bill, irrelevant to whether or not he plays jazz, I feel like it has nothing to do with whether or not he's an accountant, frankly. So he's definitely thinking in a mathematical sense for sure. Um, this seems like an odd judgment since any particular jazz playing accountant is obviously a jazz player. But that wasn't what the question was. The question is, what is the probability that he's an accountant, not whether or not he's a jazz player. So I don't know. I think the logic there seems slightly flawed. But to what higher vantage point do we appeal in saying that the judgment is wrong? Okay. Experimental psychologists use two gold standards: probability theory and decision theory. Very interesting. The goal is to read through all of this. We're about 23 minutes into the video, but I would like to have a little bit of closure here. And thankfully, the way he organizes his book is so that it's not too overwhelming. But let's try to, I think we can be able to finish this whole section. But I think we're not going to be able to finish it in the next 6 minutes. It might take a little bit longer, 10, 15 minutes. Probability theory is the set of laws underlying rational belief. Interesting. The mathematics of probability describe equally and without distinction. So yeah, he's thinking very much in mathematical sense. The mathematics of probability describes equally and without distinction. Figuring out where your bookcase is, figuring out the temperature of the Earth's core, and estimating how many hairs were on Julius Caesar's head, it's all the same problem of how to process the evidence and observations to revise one's beliefs. So I'm going to read that one more time. The mathematics of probability describes equally and without distinction. Figuring out where your bookcase is, figuring out the temperature of the Earth's core, estimating how many hairs were on Julius Caesar's head, okay? All of that falls under probability theory. It's all the same problem of how to process the evidence and observations to revise, update one's beliefs. Similarly, decision theory is the set of laws underlying rational action and is equally applicable regardless of what one's goals and available options are. So, here we go. He says, let P such and such stand for the probability that such and such happens, and P, comma A for the probability that both A and B happen. Since it is a universal law of probability theory that the probability of A is greater than or equal to the probability of A and B happening both, the judgment that Bill plays jazz is less than the judgment that Bill plays jazz is less than the probability that Bill plays jazz. Bill is an accountant is labeled incorrect. Okay, so in the mathematical sense, I see his point. To keep it technical, you would say that this probability judgment is non-Bayesian. Okay, beliefs and actions that are rational in this mathematically well-defined sense are called Bayesian. Note that the modern concept of rationality is not about reasoning in words. I gave the example of opening your eyes, looking around, and building a mental model of a room containing a bookcase against the wall. The modern concept of rationality is generally enough to include your eyes and your brain's visual areas as things that map. It includes your wordless intuition as well. Yes, absolutely. The math doesn't care whether we use the same English language words, rational to refer to Spock and to refer to Bayesianism. The math model is a good way of achieving goals or mapping the world, regardless of whether those ways fit our perceptions and stereotypes about rationality is supposed to be. So I want to read that one more time. The math model is good ways of achieving goals or mapping the world. The math model's good ways of achieving goals or mapping the world, regardless of preconceptions, stereotypes, and even this idea of what rationality is supposed to be. So there's kind of a more detached relationship, it sounds like, when it comes to using these math models to understand what rationality really is. This does not exhaust the problem of what is meant in practice by rationality for two major reasons. So one question I do have is, do you need math to understand rationality? As a follow-up question, can rationality exist without math? And I'm curious to see what it will say. The short answer is no, you do not need math to understand rationality, and yes, rationality can exist without math. Math is a powerful tool for studying rationality, but it's not its foundation. Right now, Rob is suggesting that probability theory is the foundation for rationality. So a bit of a conundrum here as far as understanding this nature. Historically and conceptually, rationality predates formal mathematics. Okay. At its core, rationality involves a lot of things: responsiveness to reasons, goal-directed decision-making, coherence among beliefs, sensitivity to evidence. Logic can be qualitative, not quantitative. If P then Q, this contradicts that, this supports that. It's funny though, because if P then Q is a mathematical statement. Why is math often associated with rationality? Math enters when we want precision, optimization, or formal models. So probability theory, decision theory, game theory, Bayesian reasoning. Fascinating. So it kind of does validate the value of using math to optimize our rationality. These are formalized versions of rationality, not its essence. Rationality without math. You got moral rationality. I think that would be the instrumental rationality that he spoke of. Practical rationality, okay, which I would see is like more of an intuitive-based decision-making process. When to leave a bad situation, for example. Who to trust, how to explain something clearly, absolutely. These rely on judgment, not calculation. Logical rationality, recognizing contradictions, entailments, or fallacies as rational without numbers. When math becomes necessary, math becomes necessary only if you want optimal precision, and of course we do. You're modeling uncertainty numerically. You're comparing many trade-offs at scale. Can rationality exist without math? Yes, absolutely. So, but we also have like logic. Rationality can exist as logical consistency. Okay. Practical wisdom. Interesting. Intuitive but corrigible insight. What is that word? So yeah, this video is definitely going to be longer than I had hoped. Capable of being corrected, reformed, improved, or set right. Okay. And then one sentence summary: rationality does not depend on math. Math is a powerful language for expressing and refining rationality, not its source. Okay. So then he says, this does not exhaust the problem of what is meant in practice by rationality for two major reasons. First, I think we're actually gonna. I think I'm actually gonna be time disciplined here, and I think we're gonna save this for another part. We're about halfway through the video, at least halfway through this section, and I'm thinking, might as well save this for the next video. So. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope this was of interest. We covered understanding the concept of Bayesian a little bit more, understanding the nature of probability, and understanding how probability may have connections to the concept of beliefs, and understanding that to optimize rationality, we can use things like probability theory, decision theory, Bayesian concepts, and even game theory, which is something that maybe in the future we can explore and work on as well. So thank you for tuning in. I'll see y'all in a next video. Peace.